Chapter 431 Sibling Pack by Hydesgrain. When will I be able to spar against real prodigies from other races? Jason smiled when he said that, and Fasro could tell that Jason was sincere. As such, he couldn't help but say, "You can meet Midra, the knowledgeable Arior I was talking about, later. She and her sister disciple came together and they're taught by one of our race's elders. You could say that they're geniuses, but Midra might be a little bit too strong for you. Maybe you can spar with Isla. She is 10 years old and might be a little bit childish, but her strength should already be above yours. She has liquefied around 150 drops of mana, so you could give it a try because your eyes, the origin flame you possess, and your combat experience might balance your weaker physical strength and mana output." Jason was a little bit astonished that the Arior race brought a 10-year-old Arior to a planet with low mana density and purity where a huge war had devastated everything. It seemed a little bit irresponsible. However, on the other side, the young Arior might be able to learn lots of important things at a young age too. Nevertheless, Jason was of the opinion that the dangers were too high compared to the gains, and he could only stare at Fasro with complex emotions. "Well, it's the decision." That was Jason's final thought before he nodded his head as he said with a faint smile, "After we report the information the Afrita revealed, I would like to meet Midra and Isla, if possible." Jason wanted to inquire much more information about other races, the Arior race, and much more about other themes. He was only missing someone who was knowledgeable enough and could tell him everything he wanted to know. After that was settled, Fasro and Jason returned to the Shiabi clan patriarch, who was already waiting for them impatiently. They explained everything necessary, and when they had finished, the patriarch clenched his fists as he asked once again, "You said, several 100,000 Afrita are in the Yazlorn caves?" Jason just nodded his head, and his masters that had stayed with the Shiabi patriarch for the last few minutes looked at him with a meaningful gleaming in their eyes. It was not difficult to perceive that he had used up every single trace of mana within his body, and hearing what happened in the short time they hadn't been with Jason caused him to frown. He saw this but tried to ignore the glaring eyes and simply showed that he was perfectly fine. After the report was finished, Jason explained to his master quickly what they hadn't reported to the Shiabi clan patriarch before he left with Fasro. Shane and Dahlia looked after him, while Emily had appeared from behind mumbling, "Why does this scene seem so sad? As if Jason has become independent." When Dahlia heard this, she couldn't help but become completely quiet as Shane said, "His blacksmithing capabilities exceeded mine, and if I were to be honest, I never taught him much about martial art technique or anything else either. At most I motivated him to work a little bit harder if that was even needed." Dahlia nodded her head when Shane said that, as she said, "I couldn't even teach him about beast creators. He is never there to give him lessons either way." Somehow, the situation had turned for the worst, and Emily was cursing herself about the deep mental wounds she had inflicted. "Why am I so stupid? Read the situation before saying something so idiotic." Jason didn't notice anything about his master's state, and if he were to know about their thoughts, he would immediately disagree. He was thankful for everything they had done. His masters gave him the opportunity to become who he was right now, and he likes his current self. As such, there was nothing he could complain about, and if there wouldn't be a war right now, Jason would be even happier. Only a few minutes passed before Jason landed in the center of the Arior race's camp, where he was eyed from all sides. Artemis Wing, which he had used to follow Fasro's high speed, dispersed, and he utilized his mana eyes in order to check out how many Arior the camp inhabited and how high their average mana core stage was. Most Arior seemed to be at the peak Lick or lowest Prisma stage, which was not surprising after Jason had heard how young most of them should be. If Fasro didn't lie to him, most Arior around him should be 50 years old or younger. This was great to know, but also somewhat frightening because his masters had already lived for more than 2 centuries, yet their strength was almost negligible against those of the Arior. Looking around, he senses a few hostile auras radiating from a few Arior, which surprised him a little bit. It was nothing noteworthy to be glared at or even looked at with hostility, but what astonished Jason was the fact that he could see the hostile aura instead of sensing it. Is that some new, or maybe upgraded ability my eyes received after the primal awakening of my bloodline? Jason was not sure about that, but it was definitely advantageous because he was able to imprint the mana fluctuations of everyone who released hostility towards him. This was a great feature his mana eyes had received, but Jason felt that it was nothing permanent. He was not sure why, but his gut feeling told him so. As such, he thought that it was not a new ability he was supposed to receive yet, and an external means should have temporarily unlocked it. Has something happened to me during the last few hours? Yet, except the fact that he was almost obliterated by an Afri that had tried to explode his mana core, nothing should have changed. It can't be the compressed drop of life force, right? I wasn't even in touch with that. He had followed Fasro for the whole time and entered a small, high-technology advanced-looking tent where he could see 2 Arior floating around. The Arior with around 150 liquefied drops of mana, Jason assumed to be Isla, lamented. Everything here is boring and I can't even absorb the surrounding mana, it's way too disgusting with all the impurities within. It might even deteriorate my cultivation foundation. However, the moment Fasro entered the room, the female Arior's mood heightened as she shouted out. Brother, you're back. Where have you been so long? Shouldn't the interrogating take a few minutes at most? Oh. Who's that? Jason now began to partially understand why Isla, the 10-year-old Arior, had been following the Arior race to the Argos. Fasro, her brother, was probably supposed to train her, or something like that. Yet, after the Arior, he assumed to be Midra said. Mother has messaged us and explained what we should do with the Afrita and the other common races. If you've received important information, report to her first. Mother. Is Argos some sort of family resort? Jason was a little bit confused, and Fasro noticed that as he said. I'm sorry Jason. I forgot to tell you that Midra and Isla are my sisters and the elder I've talked about is our mother, MLASD. He just nodded, wondering what he should use with the information about Fasro's mother's name. In the end, Jason had already expected that Fasro was not someone normal because he was able to speak human tongue fluently, and his knowledge about other races seemed to be vast too. It's okay, but I guess you're one of the prodigies you were talking about earlier too, right? Jason smiled lightly and Fasro could only say. My sisters are more talented in the ways of cultivation, but my strong characteristics are useful for different tasks. This made Jason curious, but before he could ask, Isla, who stood next to Fasro, mumbled. Why is such a weak human doing here? He just entered the lick stage. This caused Jason to blink with his eyes as he averted his attention from Fasro to his little sister as a sly smile appeared on his face. Do you want to see how weak I am? Chapter 432 Exchange of Information by Hydesgrain. Do you want to see how weak I am? Fasro knew that Jason wanted to spar with someone strong from a foreign race, but at the same time, he knew his little sister the best. As such, he had to intervene before anything could escalate. You've just used up your entire mana. Replenish it first and then you two may fight. This sounded logical and Jason, who was already ready to fight, calmed down before he stared at the mana fluctuations radiating from Isla. She doesn't show any signs of hatred within her mana fluctuation. Was I just seeing things earlier? Oh, what's that? Jason couldn't see any emotions intertwined in Isla's mana, however, what he could perceive was her fighting spirit. She was eager to fight and have some fun, even if that meant that she had to overwhelm someone with her strength of 150 liquefied drops of mana. According to what Jason had understood, absorbing mana on Argos was not good for the Arior race and rather bad. This was interesting. Are the impurities within the naturally generated mana the cause for humans to have such a slow advancement process in their mana core? At least it could be possible considering the amount of impurities a mana core absorbs throughout years of absorbing the surrounding mana. It was not an unlikely theory he had in mind, but it was still interesting to know that humans might have a better mana absorption talent than one would think. With purer mana, humans should be able to increase their mana core rank much faster, and breaking into the Lick stage wouldn't be too problematic, even for the most common citizens. Nevertheless, pure mana was not something they could acquire, just because they wanted to have it. Argos mana was becoming stronger with each day passing, and it would take an eon until the world core's limitation to increase its naturally generated mana would be reached. After Jason had calmed down from his excitement, he introduced himself to Isla and Midra before his gaze remained on Midra. "Your brother said that you're more knowledgeable than he is. Is that correct?" he bluntly asked, not minding the proper etiquette most humans showed other foreign races. In Jason's opinion, the Arior race wouldn't be on Canir, or protect the Shiabi clan, if they didn't receive lots of benefits from them. These benefits originated from the fact that the Shiabi clan had a soul bond with a curse cleansing ability, and Jason was interested to figure out why exactly this ability was so useful, or even rare, that the Arior clan sent out so many young prodigies of their race. Midra looked at her brother for a short moment before nodding her head that was made up from quicksilver. Jason was sure others would feel weird around the Arior race, without another human next to them, but that was not the case for him. The only difference they had was their looks, but that didn't make them less interesting for Jason. His mana eyes detected everything within the Arior race, and with the information Fasro had provided him, Jason assumed something. As such, he turned to Fasro as he mumbled, "Are you the oldest child of your family?" This might not be important for others, but he wanted to know why Fasro said that Midra was the most knowledgeable Arior in their camp. "I am the oldest, but I was taught differently than my sisters. The Arior race is similar to mankind in that case. Most male Arior are taught martial art techniques, how to wage war, what there is to know about other races, blacksmithing, inscribing runes and magic circles, and so on. Meanwhile, different from the human race where one's gender doesn't determine if someone is superior to the other, female Arior are superior to the males. Their comprehension is better in most cases, while the same applies to their mana absorption. There are a few more points, but I think you get what I mean." Fasro said everything in the universal language because he found it easier to talk in that language instead of the human tongue, and Midra looked at her brother weirdly when she heard Jason. "I think I got that, yes." He spoke in perfect universal language without missing a single pronunciation, which was exactly what Fasro wanted to show Midra, who was also interested in other races. She had learned many languages, but the human tongue was the most difficult to speak amongst all languages she had studied. As such, she didn't like to speak in it. But now that she saw Jason, and that he was able to speak in the universal language, her interest increased manifolds. Thus, her little hesitance when Fasro had entered their tent with a human, receded, and she began to speak with Jason. Several hours had passed in which Jason got to know much more information. Yet, what he had been unable to ask was information about the Celestia race. He had hoped that their name would fall during his chat with Midra, but that didn't happen. Nevertheless, he received a vast amount of information and his head was brimming with all kinds of new things he got to know. Apparently, as Jason had assumed, the universal cultivation ranking was not only utilized for someone's mana core rank, but also to grade weapons, materials, potions, and so on. This was interesting and easy to understand for everyone. Other than that, he got to know more about the foreign races that had invaded Argos, the current stance within their worlds, their average strength, and much more information. He didn't really understand the names of the cultivation stages she was talking about because Midra's excitement caused her to speak extremely fast. In the end, Jason had procured new information, before he was even able to ask something about the previously mentioned facts he had received. Yet, instead of asking Midra about the cultivation stages more in detail, this could wait. He had yet to break into the Prisma stage that was said to be the most arduous and longest step in constructing one's foundation. Even prodigies of other races are said to require more than 50 years to achieve this step, while it would already be an extraordinary achievement to break into the Ascendian stage before the age of 100 years. This was not something higher races could attain easily, and even grand races would take long to break into the Ascendian stage. However, what were 100 years, if one was able to reach a stage mankind wouldn't even reach in the next few millennia? It was already difficult for them to solidify one small prismarine crystal, and they had yet to find out that after solidifying 9 prismarine crystals, one had to envelop 3 small crystals with one rotating large crystal. Jason had already known this because of the owl bear he had encountered within the large mana vein several months ago, but that was not the case with mankind, who was oblivious to their insignificance. After several hours had passed, his mana core was finally filled with mana, and he had to find a way to distract himself from the information his mind had yet to digest. Thus, he turned towards Isla, who was extremely bored and not interested in the exchange of information between him and Midra. "I'm ready to fight. Do you want to spar?" His question was simple, but the fighting spirit he suddenly showed had been such a sudden change within Jason, that it astonished Isla and even Midra, who had wanted to talk or with Jason. She had received lots of information about the human race from Midra and wanted to receive more. However, after thinking about it, she could only think that Jason was probably overflowing with the information he didn't understand. As such, she held back, as Isla jumped up. "Finally! Let's go!" She didn't know why, but despite Jason's low quantity of liquefied drops of mana, Isla thought that he might not be as weak as she had initially estimated him to be. As such, she wanted to use her whole strength in order to fight Jason, who was thinking of a way to prevent Isla from overwhelming him with her brute force. "I have to make use of my combat experience. She is several years younger than I am and doesn't have any, or not much combat experience." Chapter 433 Brute Force vs. Experience by Hydesgrain. Inside the Arior Races camp, there was a huge combat training ground and Jason entered it, next to Frasso and his sisters. Isla was drawn between being excited and bored, thinking that her spar with Jason could either turn into an interesting match or become utter humiliation for the young human. The only thoughts that prevented Isla to think that it might be the latter were Jason's confidence, her brother's words, and the fact that she perceived something about Jason that was not ordinary. The number of liquefied drops or mana within Jason's mana core shouldn't be the biggest indicator for his combat prowess. In the end, she could only wait and see how exactly their spar would turn out. When they had arrived in the area that was used for sparrings, Jason's arrival attracted some attention. He was the first human that was allowed to enter the combat grounds of the Arior race. However, nobody said anything because Jason was with Fasro and the rest. They were the children of one of their race's elders and eligible to take someone from a different race with them. Nevertheless, it was uncommon for them to do so, and the present Arior had mixed feelings about Jason. He walked around with confidence, but his mana core rank spoke volumes. At least that was what the Arior could see, and they began to gossip with each other. Jason ignored the gossip around him and halted in his tracks when Fasro told them that they could spar at the open field in front of them. He and Isla prepared themselves for the spar before they walked away from each other. After they had reached a distance of around 100 meters, both went into their respective combat stance before Fasro started with the countdown. Jason took a deep breath, and the moment the spar with Isla started, he exerted the weightless steps technique at the perfect mastery to accelerate his pace instantly. He charged forward and manifested several icicles which he shot at Isla, who had already used her affinity to create multiple Quicksilver spears. His icicles and the Quicksilver spear clashed with each other, and as expected, the Quicksilver spears shattered the icicles into smithereens before they advanced towards Jason. Yet, instead of halting his steps or evading the Quicksilver spears which would slow his speed tremendously, Jason summoned Artemis wings on his back which he spread open. His feet left the ground and only one swing with Artemis wings was required to avoid the quicksilver spears that brushed past him. A moment later Jason exchanged Artemis, who was inside his mana core, with Solaris before he enveloped his body with its flames. This astonished Isla a little bit and she was unsure what the wings and black flame were. Both felt extremely weird. Her inexperience was revealed and she panicked a little bit, which allowed Jason to approach her closer. He shot several compressed fireballs manifested from Solaris affinity that had reached the prowess of 100 drops of liquefied mana towards her. At that moment Isla regained her senses, but instead of trying to perceive what the fireballs were made of, she created another batch of quicksilver spears. After shooting them out they clashed with each other. However, contrary to Isla's expectations, her quicksilver spears disintegrated while the compressed fireballs exploded, creating a smokescreen that covered both sides. At that moment, Jason concealed his mana core completely while perceiving everything through his mana eyes. Meanwhile, Isla couldn't see anything and the mana fluctuations she released were barely enough to perceive Jason's rough position. Unfortunately, it had already been too late and Jason emerged out of the smokescreen with several more compressed fireballs that flew towards Isla. From the previous clash, she knew that Jason's fire ability was weird but powerful. It could weaken her Quicksilver Spear's strength by a large margin, and both the Quicksilver Spears and fireballs turned into equally strong forces. As such, she had to retort to a different tactic, which led her to erect a huge Quicksilver wall between the two of them. At that moment, Jason's mana eyes perceived tiny fluctuations within the Quicksilver wall, and a quarter of a second later, Byakuya manifested in his hand as he thrusted it out. Byakuya, who was a part of him, was instantly enveloped with a thin, compressed layer of Solaris black flame. It pierced through the Quicksilver wall, right through the unstable fluctuations, severing them. This led to a chain reaction caused by Solaris mana nullification and the whole Quicksilver wall collapsed. Jason, who had already seen this coming, jumped through the collapsing Quicksilver wall as he activated his Mana Eyes Abyssal effect and the Petrification Curse, which he intertwined with his killing intent that leaked from his eyes. He was fully aware that he was not allowed Isla to regain her composure for a single moment. His combat awareness and experience were much higher than hers, but the simple Quicksilver Spears she had created easily were strong enough to destroy Jason's strongest attacks. The compressed fireballs he could manifest were his strongest attack, simply because Solaris had become the strongest out of his soul bonds. Adding the fact that he did not receive the soul amplification of a single soul bond, he was bound to be weaker than Isla. This was frustrating because he was confident to defeat her if he were only a little bit stronger. Nevertheless, his overlapping attack through his mana eyes showed a slight effect, which allowed him to gain the upper hand. Combat experience and one's perception were significant factors to decide over victory or defeat. However, Isla, whose body stiffened when Jason's eyes seemed to be about to devour her entire being, unleashed every ounce of strength, astonishing Frasso and Midra, who perceived this. She is forced to use her whole strength. Midra mumbled, not sure what was going on with her little sister as Jason manifested several dozen compressed, black fireballs around him. Thanks to Solaris residing within his mana core and the Netherworld's fort body refining technique, he was able to summon a large number of compressed fireballs in succession. His mana consumption was not too high either, and it didn't take long before more than 100 fireballs had already crashed into Isla, burning through the mana she had released. There was no way for Jason to approach Isla because the mana overwhelmed his. This would turn into a huge disadvantage for him. As such, he had to use Solaris Flame, until the stored mana would have been used up. At the same time, Isla, who felt threatened for the first time in her life, couldn't help as she used every trick she had up to her sleeves. Thus, she used a secret technique that merged her body with her affinity for a short moment as a huge quicksilver beam shot out of her abdomen area. Jason, whose mana eyes had already perceived that something was wrong, tried to evade the high-velocity quicksilver beam that was much stronger than someone with 150 liquefied drops of mana should be able to generate. Despite that, he knew that he would be too slow, and Jason could tell that death was approaching him at a rapid pace. As such, he was about to unseal his soul amplification curse in order to survive, as Fasro had already appeared in front of him. He lifted his liquefied hand and blocked the huge quicksilver beam that was about to obliterate Jason as he said, "Good job, humans. You forced my sister to use her whole strength. Not bad." Chapter 434 Secret Technique by Hydesgrain. Jason knew that he had only survived Isla's attack because Fasro had protected him. As such, he thanked him properly before he stared at Isla. Midra had appeared next to her and it looked like Isla was going to be lectured. "I know that you want to win, but this was a friendly spar against someone with 4 liquefied drops of mana. How did you even think about using our secret technique? Do you know that not even someone at the same rank would survive this? I'll have to report this to my mother, otherwise, we won't know when you will act impulsively again." Jason heard everything and couldn't help but smile dryly. He had already felt that he wouldn't be able to survive the compressed quicksilver beam attack, but hearing the same from Midra felt weird. Secret technique. It was interesting to figure out that something like secret techniques existed, and from what Jason had sensed, Isla's attack was comparable to an attack from someone between 200 and 250 liquefied drops of mana. This means that the secret technique unleashed a single attack that was 1/3 stronger than her normal capabilities were. Jason was not sure where this extra power came from, but after starting at Isla with his mana eyes he was able to guess something. Is it life force again? From the looks of it, Isla's mana core that was enveloped by quicksilver had lost some of its luster, and Jason began to wonder if that had something to do with life force. He knew that a mana core would lose its luster once one was severely injured, the mana core itself had been damaged, or one was dead. Thus, there was something new Jason had to figure out. Is the main purpose of secret technique to exceed one's limitations and create one lethal attack? Maybe the latter part is only about Isla's secret technique, but the former should be the case for most secret techniques. From the talk he had with Midra, Jason knew that there were more techniques than he had initially expected. Even the types of grades were many more than he had expected. It was obvious that the Terra grade was the bottom line for most techniques. However, they were not divided into 3 segments as he had expected. Rather, they were 5, namely, Basic, Intermediate, Advanced, Peak, Superior. As if that was not enough, these Terra grade techniques were mainly utilized by common and some higher races, while there were also 2 more grades for technique, Midra was aware of. The next highest grade for certain cultivation and martial art technique was the Heaven grade, followed by the Lunar grade. However, even the Arior race, one of the higher races, had yet to procure a basic Lunar grade technique. Most races were of the opinion that Terra grade techniques said that one was a common race, while Heaven grade techniques would make a race into a higher race. Jason didn't care about any of that because he had yet to procure something better than a Terra intermediate technique. His body refinement state was not great, but it was better than nothing. Nevertheless, Jason thought that it would take some time before he would be able to acquire a better technique that was suitable for himself. Furthermore, the Netherworld's Fort technique was the best he could use right now because it lessened his mana consumption and increased his control over the black affinity Solaris had inherited to him. This was very advantageous, and Jason, who was still standing behind Fasro, didn't even notice that he was eyed oddly. The surrounding Arior wanted to see how Isla, who was deemed as a little prodigy, would overwhelm Jason. Yet, everything they could see made them believe that Jason was at the upper hand and that Isla had to resort to her last, final trump card in order to turn the tables. She had only won because of her secret technique, and everyone was aware of this. As such, Jason, who was deemed as someone weak because of his 4 drops of liquefied mana, turned into one of the most talented humans they had seen until now. After the spar was concluded, Fasro had brought Jason back to the Shiabi clan headquarters because Isla's mood had worsened. It had been long since she had been lectured by her sister, and according to her, Jason was at fault for everything. Knowing that Isla was only 10 years old, Jason didn't hold a grudge, and instead, he said that he would go return to his masters. Fasro nodded his head, saying that this would probably be the best they could do for now before he accompanied Jason. There was no reason to do so, but Fasro was curious about Jason's hidden trumps. He was also quite proficient in fighting, as his combat awareness and quick thinking were great. His mana absorption rate should be fast too, at least if his senses didn't perceive Jason's earlier state wrong. After Jason had used up his stored amount of mana in order to survive the Ifri's suicidal attack, his entire being seemed to have screamed for more mana. From the looks of it, Jason was proficient in passively absorbing mana, and the only issue he had was the amount of mana in his surroundings. Fasro could see the exact same right now. Jason's surroundings were void of mana because he had already absorbed everything. If he actively absorbs mana, he would need many lick-grade mana stones. I wonder how high the limits of his absorption rate are. With that in mind and the words he recalled having said to Jason about their prodigy's cultivation stage according to their age, Fasro couldn't help but ask. I'm curious, how many drops of liquefied mana can you create in 1 month? That is if you have enough mana in the surroundings and enter a fully concentrated state. I know you won't be able to tell me the exact number, but what is your assumption? Jason didn't expect to hear such a question and he had to think about it for some time. How should I know that with the stigma fully utilized? It should be much higher than actively doing so, but I can't even actively absorb mana because the mana in my surroundings is way too low for the needs I have. He was unable to figure out the stigma's limitations because the surrounding mana is not dense and pure enough. As such, he could only say what he had already figured out, which was the assumption without utilizing the stigma. In a fully concentrated state, with enough mana, I should be able to create around 10 drops of mana, I think. This was fewer than Fasro expected, but if he knew that Jason was not talking about common drops of mana, but his unique liquefied drops of mana that required 3 times more mana than common ones. Furthermore, Jason was still adjusting to the liquefaction process. After Fasro had asked this question, they became silent again. When they had arrived above the Shiabi clan headquarters, Fasro bid farewell before he had returned. Jason dived down to the headquarters, without attracting too much attention, and it didn't take long before he found his masters. This was thanks to his mana eyes. Once he said his masters the most important information Midra had told him, Jason began to look out for Yoon and the others. They had told him about their plan to scout for other humans that were strong enough to fight against the foreign races. Gathering those would increase their combat strength by a large margin, and it might even help to create a small protected zone on Kanir. This zone would be the Chandra country, and Yoon, Milan and Iska felt that it was necessary to start somewhere before expanding when the time had come. His 3 friends had yet to hear the news about the number of a freighter that was somewhere nearby, but Jason was about to do that. After that, he doubted that Yoon and the others would continue with their plan because it would be more important to take care of the freighter. Jason was confident in his own combat strength, but once there was a large number of opponents with more than 100 drops of liquefied mana, he would become incapable of fighting all at once. This was not the case with a high number of a freighter with less than 100 drops of liquefied mana, because their fire's ability would be nullified, or even absorbed from Solaris. As such, he might as well be labeled as invincible if he were to fight against those a freighter. However, when he had found Yoon and the others, he couldn't help but gulp. What the hell happened with you guys? You didn't bathe in blood, right? Chapter 435 Plan. By Hydesgrain. Yoon, Milan, and Iska were littered in blood and shallow cuts that had almost been healed. Meanwhile, Arya looked like she was drained of all her energy, which told Jason that she had to use her healing affinity quite often. He was not sure what exactly her affinity could do, but he had already seen a similar affinity to hers. This was the healing affinity he was talking about, and by looking at the shallow cuts on his friends, his assumption should have been correct. Just fought a little bit against someone at the Grandmagus rank, if I can even call it like that. Yoon said, slightly hesitating as he looked into Jason's eyes. Since he and the others had figured out that Jason was able to fight head-on against an Ifrita that had liquefied 100 drops of mana, their confidence as prodigies from big clans had been shattered. This was only obvious, and Jason would have felt exactly the same if he were to be in his friend's situations. His advancement had just been too fast, which was all thanks to the fact that he had undergone the first primal awakening of his Celestia bloodline. If he were to tell them that his soul amplification was currently nullified and that he was able to unseal this nullified state to receive a soul amplification of around 40%, they would probably try to beat him up. As such, Jason simply smiled when he saw the gazes before he said, "Let's go somewhere quiet, I've to tell you a little information about the Ifrita race." Thus, 15 minutes had passed and Jason finished his short report after they had found a quiet place. Everyone felt uncomfortable with the sheer quantity of information about the Ifrita race that seemed to be hiding in the Yazlorn caves, and Yoon couldn't help but ask. If their number is already that much, what are they even waiting for? The Yazlorn caves are barely behind Chandra country's borders, and I doubt that they're too weak to overwhelm the whole country. Even the Arior should have problems in facing so many Ifrita at once. That is if the Ifrita race has brought some of their stronger individuals. Iska, Milan, and Arya nodded their heads, while Jason couldn't help but smile when he heard, stronger individuals. Even for a common race, the Prisma stage shouldn't be too difficult to reach, and Jason assumed that the Ifrita race's Prisma stages were either average Ifrita within their 100s or younger prodigies below that age. Nevertheless, Yoon's question was not without reason. Jason had yet to find out the reason for the Ifrita race to hide within the Yazlorn caves instead of attacking the Chandra country directly. They could either be waiting for more reinforcement, for the best timing to attack, or to ambush other foreign races once they wanted to attack the Chandra country. In the end, all possibilities were open, and it was just a matter of time until they would be able to figure out the truth. After Yoon had asked this question, everyone became silent before they had begun to plan something to ease the Xiaobi clan's current situation. Several hours had passed and a new day had begun when they finished constructing their plan. "Should we really propose this plan to the Xiaobi clan and your masters, Jason?" Everyone was uncertain, and even Jason was not sure if their plan was suicidal or clever. There were multiple plans they had thought about, but the one they wanted to propose to the Xiaobi clan patriarch and his masters, or more likely Shane, was the simplest, yet also most efficient. It was easy and not difficult to understand. Jason and the others wanted to use Shane's and others' spatial affinity to jump to the border of different countries which they wanted to enter with small groups. After entering those countries that were the most likely to have strong families and clans that resisted to the foreign races' schemings, they wanted to convince them to gather in the Chandra country. From then on, they wanted to create a large army to fight against the hostile foreign races, while trying to save as many innocent citizens and clans as possible. There were several big clans that had been completely submitted to foreign races, and this was something Yoon and the others wanted to resolve too. Jason was not sure if that was even possible, considering that it was highly likely that the foreign races forced the highest authorities of those clans to sign certain soul contracts, but he just agreed to it. Their plan was worth a try, but at the same time, it was extremely dangerous for those teams that were to invade the other countries. Not only would they have to pay attention to the surrounding foreign races, but even the stronger clans and families they wanted to save might betray them. As such, it was more likely that the Xiaobi clan patriarch and even Shane rejected their plan. However, before they were even able to present their plans, everyone received several notifications on their quantum bracelet, which led Jason to look at the other's holographic screen that appeared in front of them. Jason had destroyed his quantum bracelet when they left Terebrine, and now he had to lean in towards Arya, who sat next to him, to see something. Arya felt weird when she sensed that, but upon noticing that Jason didn't have a quantum bracelet around his wrists, she calmed down as she moved the holographic screen a little bit. Strong mana fluctuations have been perceived near the border between the Chandra country and the Drake Kingdom. Everyone unable to fight against foreign races, please evacuate. To the rest, please gather in front of the headquarters. It's highly likely that a large-scale battle will occur. When Jason read this, he mumbled. The border to the Drake Kingdom. The Chandra country is next to the Drake Kingdom. What kind of bad luck is that? I doubt the Drake family patriarch wants to come over. I guess he shouldn't know about the fact that I or Shane are here too. Jason felt uncomfortable with everything that had even remotely to do with the Drake family, clan, and patriarch. He had yet to find out what happened to Greg, Malia, and the Flay parents, and how they were doing. His gut feeling told him that they were still alive, but Jason was also aware of the fact that Greg should have been forced into a soul contract with the whole Drake family. The same might have happened with Malia, and the only thing that Jason could hope for right now was that neither of them would belong to those strong mana fluctuations the notification informed them. As such, Jason hurried up and rushed to the location they should gather. If he were to encounter Greg or Malia, which was unlikely, yet possible, he might be able to defeat them, without killing either of them. This was not the best solution, but the only one Jason could think of. What else should he do? Abduct Greg and Malia, which might result in them being forced to kill themselves, as it might be demanded in one of the many harsh clauses the soul contract they've signed might state. He obviously didn't want them to die, and it would be better to search for the best solution instead of doing something that might endanger them. Nevertheless, Jason thought that the possibility of encountering Greg and Malia was small. Rather than encountering them, there should be something different that approached them from the Drake Kingdom's border. However, the moment Jason had appeared at the meeting point, he heard that another notification had arrived. There are lots of strong mana fluctuations coming from the Yazlorn caves too. Are the Ephrata race also attacking us? Oh shit. Jason mumbled subconsciously as he noticed that the Arior arrived. They dived down and Fasro, Midra, and Isla approached him as Fasro explained to Jason the situation they've to face. The Ephrata attacked with a small number of several thousand soldiers, nothing more. Meanwhile, the Myoldra race, which colludes with the Drake family, according to the Shiabi clan's patriarch, seems to take the Chandra country more seriously. Their number, in addition to the humans next to them, is more than 40,000. Jason just nodded his head, not sure what Fasro expected him to say as he got an idea. What is the average strength of both sides? Fasro wanted to hear a different question, but what Jason asked was fine too. As such he answered. The Ephrata has only utilized a few Prisma stages, while most of the Lick stages have around 100 drops of liquefied mana within them. Meanwhile, not a single individual within the Myoldra's army has that kind of strength. The weakest should have around 150 drops of liquefied mana inside their mana core, with the vast majority being stronger. Even though that was bad news, Jason was glad that the Drake clan's army had only individuals above the low Lick stage. This meant Greg and Malia were definitely not among them. As such he sighed in relief before he said confidently, I can take care of every single Ephrata below a mana core filled with 100 drops of liquefied mana. As long as I don't have to face other, stronger Ephrata, I'll be good to go. Fasro noticed how confident Jason was as he said, Alright, I'll tell the Shabi clan patriarch that a few Arior and you will be enough to take care of the Ephrata's army. Huh. Jason eyed Fasro weirdly as his eyes widened. Was that what I said? Chapter 436 Suicide Squad by Hydesgrain. Jason was not sure if he had heard Fasro right, but when he saw how he approached the Shabi clan patriarch, Jason couldn't help but think that this was a bad joke. He followed Fasro and tried to eavesdrop, which caused his mood to plummet. We need to focus on the Myoldra race's army. They're another higher race and among the stronger ones at that. The Ephraites' army doesn't have anyone at and above the Mana core rank with 6 solidified prismarine crystals. 5 more of Ariel's, and Jason will take care of the Ephraites army. Once we're done, I'll bring the other Ariels as reinforcement. Until then, Midra will take the lead of the Ariel group. Please consult her about the Myoldra race's army. Our small suicide squad will have to go now. Fasro sounded like he was ordering the Shiabi clan patriarch, which was exactly what was going on. Jason noticed this and could only bit his lower lips before he rushed forward as he said, "If you guys let me die against an Ephrite with more than 100 drops of liquefied drops of mana, I'll curse all of you." He was not sure how strong the Myoldra race was, but considering that Fasro was reluctant to employ himself, Jason and only 5 more Arior to the Ephrite race's army made his stance clear. The Ephrite race is a joke against the Myoldra race. Even though Jason felt overwhelmed, he understood the importance of employing as many troops as possible against the Myoldra race. A strong higher-ranked race. It was a bad sign to hear that the Drake family was backed up from a strong higher-ranked race, but worse was that Jason was not even sure if there was another stronger higher-ranked race or not. Even if there was, would that be a good sign or bad? He was unsure about that, and Jason was only glad that someone at the Ascension stage was unable to enter Argos easily. This was the only good news he had heard from Midra after he had asked her about it. Apparently, the world bridges, as the rifts were called, were still in an unstable state and wouldn't allow anyone at a higher stage than the low Prisma stage to enter Argos. That was at least for now, and Midra had also explained that it was highly likely that some world bridges might be different. Mankind had already reported about abyssal ranked rifts, and the knowledge about what kind of beasts emerged out of those world bridges proved that stronger races might emerge on Argos, in the near future at that. It didn't even have to be in the future, and the only requirement for a stronger race to emerge on Argos was a stable world bridge. This didn't sound great, and Jason was already glad that grand races didn't seem to care about their race. Other than that, there was also the possibility that they couldn't enter Argos without risking the youngest offspring's lives. If they were even faster at absorbing mana than higher races, which was evident, their average Prisma stages were less than 40 years old, while prodigies would be around Isla's age. Without combat experience, even their high mana core rank wouldn't bring any benefits, and there might even be many offsprings of grand races that would die needlessly. Jason found that the risks did not outweigh the benefits, and he could only hope that his assumption was correct. Nevertheless, even the common and higher-ranked races that had already appeared on Argos were more than enough to cause a huge headache. Fasro didn't say anything to Jason's words, but the Shabi clan patriarch could only look at him. At the same time, Shane and Dahlia had appeared next to Jason as Shane said, "You won't die against those Ephrite, all right?" With these simple words being said, he turned towards Fasro. "We'll join the fight against the Myoldra race's army. Don't let Jason die. He's very important to mankind. I can see that. We'll take care of him." Fasro's words were simple, but the weight they carried was huge, and Shane could only smile lightly, thinking that the Arior in front of him was sincere. What Merl Shiabi, the patriarch, who could only look between Shane and Fasro, heard confused him, and he was unsure what to say. Important to mankind. Isn't he exaggerating a little bit because Jason is his disciple? It looked like Merl was still unaware of Shane's real identity, which was something that wondered about both Shane and Dahlia. They had spent lots of years in the young time together, and Shane looked exactly like his younger self. There might be little adjustment in his facial features, caused by Dahlia's silver origin flame, but other than that, Shane looked the same. If they knew that Merl knew that Shane had appeared in front of him since the beginning, both Shane and Dahlia would have felt embarrassed to even doubt their friend's sincerity. Merl knew about Shane and Dahlia, but he was also aware that speaking to them like old friends might attract unwanted attention. Right now, their identity might be deemed as unimportant, but all of them knew that there were still many problems revolving around Shane. He might be unaware of most facts, but Shane should have already noticed that something was off. If I had only stopped your massacre of the entire Shaw clan, the other big clan's prodigies wouldn't have killed either. You know that you're a victim of his schemings too. Nobody knew of the Shaby clan patriarch's thoughts, and there was no time for him to think too much about Shane either. His country had to face the attacks of 2 foreign races at the same time. After Shane and Dahlia had appeared in front of him, Jason talked to them for a minute before he rushed after Fasro, who had already left him to gather the remaining Arior that would accompany them. Fasro knew that fighting an entire army of several thousand Afrita might be too much for 6 Arior and a human to face. Yet, taking 1 or 2 more Arior with him wouldn't make a large difference for the Afrita army. Rather than that, it would weaken their combat prowess against the Myoldra race's army that had around 40,000 individuals. Every single Arior was required on that side, to prevent as many casualties as possible. Fasro was also unsure what exactly the Afrita race was trying to achieve by sending a small part of their entire army that consisted of several 100,000 Afrita and Afri, but there was something wrong about it. This doubt increased further after he received the intel that the Afrita race's small army of several thousand Afrita and Afri had on average around 100 liquefied drops of mana within their mana core. It's probably a distraction from something, but why are they retorting to such a petty trick? Or do they think that we don't know about their huge army? Is their plan to show how weak they're, only to reveal their whole strength as a means to surprise us? Despite sounding ridiculous and suicidal, Fasro's assumption was correct. Nobody would have expected that one of their own race would betray the Afrita, let alone to someone with 4 liquefied drops of mana within his mana core. Jason's mana eyes, combined with utilizing every means to intimidate his foe, were too frightening, and Jason had already demonstrated this often enough. However, even he had been astonished how efficient his mana eyes, in combination with killing intent, the abyssal ability, and the petrification curse were. It was the perfect combination, and nobody was able to deny this. Once everything was concluded, Fasro, the 5 Arior he had selected, and Jason departed without wasting any more time. Jason had summoned Artemis wings, and the others were able to fly through the air. As such, their speed was much faster than the Afrita that had to remain at the ground due to their inability to fly at a high altitude with their cultivation stage. Only 7 hours had passed when Jason and the 6 Arior saw several thousand red dots far in the distance as Fasro said. We'll prepare our ambush, just stay guarded and take care of the lowest lick stage Afrita and Afri. You don't have to pay attention to the rest. Chapter 437 Gates of Hell by Hydesgrain. Less than 10 minutes later, Jason stood in front of several thousand Afritas and Ivris that stared at him as if he was insane. Jason assumed that they wondered whether he was going to attempt suicide or if he was playing around. However, before Jason, the Afrita or Afri were able to do anything, a huge magic circle began to manifest around them on the ground. It was silver in color, and Jason immediately knew that it was the Arior's Quicksilver affinity. At the same time, the humongous-sized magic circle was manifesting. The Afrita and Afri began to notice that something was wrong. Yet, before they could react, Quicksilver spikes shot out of the suddenly manifested magic circle. There were several thousand of them, and Jason was utterly dumbfounded because he was also standing inside the Quicksilver magic circle. Fortunately, the Quicksilver spears that shot out of the magic circle didn't seem to target him. Instead, they focused on the most powerful Afritas and Ivris. Every single Afrita at the Prisma stage had been pierced by several hundred Quicksilver spears in a matter of seconds, while the remaining Quicksilver spears shot towards the Afrita and Afri at the late and mid-lick stage. When Jason saw this, he began to wonder whether he was even required, or if the 6 Arior were able to take care of everything by themselves. However, when his mana eyes perceived the Arior that hid in the thicket of the surrounding trees and bushes, Jason knew that this question was needless. Rather than them being able to do everything by themselves, they've not only exhausted the complete mana core but also used up some of their life force, I think. Jason could tell from the dimmed mana core that the Ariors had used up some of their life force. At least he assumed that to be the case. This caused him to wonder whether life force was replenishable or not. By the looks of it, this should be possible because the Arior race seemed to like using their life force during a fight. Jason was not exactly sure what the Quicksilver magic circle in front of him was, but he began to think that it was another secret technique. This secret technique seemed to use up the user's mana and life force in order to create a magic circle that attacks the most powerful opponents one after another. If they were a few more Arior with him, Jason was confident that his presence would be useless. Only then did he recall Fasro's words about that they required every single Arior while fighting against the Myoldra race's army. Is that why he wanted to take me to the Ephrata race's battlefield? Jason had been unsure why Fasro took him to the Ephrata battlefield, but everything seemed to make sense now. There were still several thousand Ephrata left, but not a single Prisma stage nor Ephritas and Ivris with more than 150 drops of liquefied mana. I'm sorry, we couldn't take care of more. There were a few unruly Ephrata that required more mana than I estimated. Jason was not sure how, but he heard Fasro's voice in his head. Unfortunately, he was unable to think about how the voice transmission with Fasro had worked. There were several thousand Ephrata and Ephri he had to take care of, after all. He retraced Artemis' wings while he was still in midair and allowed Solaris, who was already screaming out in greed, to enter his mana core. The Creato flames that had been released by the 1,000 corpses of Ephrata and Ephri that were at a higher mana core stage than Jason attracted Solaris' full attention. Jason sensed and felt this, which led him to allow Solaris to enter his mana core while he was still in midair. Just like that, huge black flames sprouted out of his back, and a faint smile emerged on Jason's face as he noticed that his experiment seemed to have worked out. While the amount of soul energy Solaris possessed increased, its flames capabilities increased too. As such, Solaris learned how its flames had to be formed and adjusted in order to replicate Artemis' wings. The Black Origin flame was hard-working and tried the same with several more body parts of Jason's other soul bonds. Only Artemis' wings worked for now, but that was more than Jason had expected. With black burning flames sprouting out of his back, Jason's appearance began to turn into that of a ferocious beast that had crawled out of hell itself. He began to descend to the ground at a slow pace, and at the same time, Jason's whole body was slowly being enveloped by compressed black flames. Only his eyes and the palms of his hands were void of flames until Byakuya appeared in one hand. Jason's soul weapon was enveloped by Solaris black flames in an instant. However, the moment both Solaris and Jason activated their stigma that began to shine brightly within a moment, Jason's appearance began to change once again. He lifted his free hand and released more than 1,000, fingertip-sized black flames that floated towards the Ephrata and Ephri corpses where they began to absorb the Creator flame. However, nobody could care less about that right now. Every single pair of eyes was trained on Jason, who was still descending to the ground. His manner was relaxed and he released an eerie tranquility as if what happened next had nothing to do with him. Jason himself was not even sure what was going on, but he felt that his connection with Solaris had deepened to a frightening degree. Before, they had already felt extremely close, but right now it was as if he and Solaris turned into one entity. At the same time, Jason could sense that there was something in a deep slumber within Solaris' deepest parts. Fasro and the 5 Arior who saw Jason from further away were unable to control their silver liquefied body that began to vibrate as Fasro mumbled. How can he look like the princes of hell? If the Ephrata and Ephri that had survived the onslaught of several tens of thousand Quicksilver swords had not been scared already, this would have changed now at the latest. Jason's mana consumption was lower than he had estimated, and from the experience he had already gained by fighting against the Ephrata and Ephri, Jason knew that Solaris could sustain itself without the need to rely on him. That was if it could absorb a few Creato flames. As such, Jason didn't want to waste much more time. Nevertheless, this didn't hinder him in increasing the supply of mana he gave Solaris, who seemed to try to do something. While supplying Solaris with more mana, Jason didn't even realize that the translucent frames of a gigantic gate could be seen from behind him. They were enveloped in Solaris black flames. However, weirdly enough, the gate's interior was completely empty. Yet, everyone who saw the outlines of the gates couldn't help feel that their life was on the line. What kind of origin flame is that? Fasro mumbled while forcing himself to stop retreating. The Ifrita and Ifri that stood in front of him were frozen on their spot and unable to move at the sight of the gate that manifested in front of them. It released an eerie aura, and only when the gate had begun to dissipate was anyone able to breathe again. Jason sensed that Solaris' strength was increasing with every second passing as the black flames it had split up began to absorb the deceased's Creato flames. It received only a few % from them directly, while the rest would be supplied after the merging process with the tiny flames. However, both Jason and Solaris could tell that the absorbed Creato flames would make a huge impact on the Origin Flame's future strength and abilities. This was something they had expected, but the final outcome was grander than either of them could have ever thought about. The entire surrounding was filled with black flames that flickered vibrantly, turning the proximity into a piece of land that had turned into hell itself. Jason took a deep breath before he took the first step as the Solaris wings flapped once, pushing him towards the first batch of scared Ifrita and Ifris. Chapter 438 God of Slaughter by Hydesgrain. In an instant, Jason had already emerged in front of the closest Ifrita, and before it could even react, Byakur had already been sliced past it. Blood and organs spilled out of the large wound Jason had instilled, but he didn't even look if the Ifrita was about to die when he had already rushed past the Ifrita. Only a fingertip-sized black flame left Jason's body as it floated towards the Ifrita's severe cut that would kill it in the next few seconds. Everyone thought that Jason was already using his whole strength, when he suddenly began to exert the weightless steps technique, increasing his already fast pace by 60%. As his speed increased, he had to increase the speed at which he was wielding Byakur too. Just like that, a few seconds had passed before the first few Ifrita had already died at his hand. The path behind him was littered with corpses, and each corpse had a small black flame lingering on them, devouring the Creato flame that would dissipate soon. Only after a few seconds had passed and the first dozen Ifrita been killed, did they realize that their life was on the line. Utilizing the Creato flame, the Ifrita and Ifri started to attack Jason with all kinds of attacks. Whether it were fire whips, balls, spears, or even firewalls trying to hinder him in his advance, every means was utilized to attack and defend against Jason's advancement. However, when he saw this, Jason could only smile slyly. He didn't even defend against the attacks that shot towards him, instead, he accepted them unconditionally. Only a few attacks were strong enough to pierce through the compressed, tightly laid on armor made up of Solaris black flames. They nullified every attack below the strength comparable to 100 liquefied drops of mana and even absorbed some of the mana from within. As such, Jason's mana began to replenish instead of decreasing, which lowered the already bad morale of the Ifrita and Ifri. Yet, Jason couldn't care less, and the only problematic enemies he could perceive were the several dozen Ifrita with around 150 drops of liquefied mana within their mana core. The only thing he could do against them was to utilize his advantage of fighting alone against several thousand enemies. If they couldn't see or attack him without killing their own brethren, Jason doubted that they would attack him. Even if they would, despite his utmost efforts to merge into a large group of Ifrita and Ifri, Jason was sure that he would still survive. In the worst-case scenario, he was still able to unseal the race individual weakening curse that nullified his high soul amplification. As such, the state he was currently in couldn't be called his peak, and Jason was fully aware of this fact. Less than 3 minutes had passed, when Shane had already massacred over 100 Ifrita and Ifri. At that time, the Ifri and Ifrita noticed that they were unable to win against Jason if nothing were to change. They felt that his mana fluctuations and everything else about Jason were still as powerful as it had been 3 minutes ago, and it was unsure how high Jason's stamina was. Maybe he was able to fight like this for several hours. The Ifrita and Ifri didn't know. Furthermore, there should be a combat unit from the Arior race nearby. Otherwise, the Quicksilver magic circle from the beginning couldn't have manifested and utilized to kill the strongest Ifrita and Ifri that were present. They had to change something. It was not long after this thought emerged within the Ifrita's mind, and the best decision they could think of was brutal but the most efficient way to get rid of Jason. Overclocking the Creato Flame with their own and the Askron race's life fist that was stored within every single Ifri to nurture the Creato Flame. Not even 5 minutes had passed since the fight had started, when Jason began to notice that the Ifrita and Ifri retreated as far as possible. At the same time, he could tell that Solaris wanted to advance further, increase its strength and become an unparalleled existence. However, that was easier said than done because Jason was unable to give Solaris every single vacant soul energy he had within his body. His other soul bonds required some of it too. As such, instead of allowing Solaris to increase its soul energy and become stronger without a qualitative increment, Jason told it to start creating the life force absorption ability. This was important because his mana eyes perceived that there was a compressed, blood-red drop of life force within every single Ifri. The drop of compressed life force belonged to the Askron race, and Jason was already aware of the lethality of this life force drop combined with the Creato Flame. Solaris had to create the life force absorption ability too, otherwise, he doubted that he would come out victorious from this huge battlefield he was in. Jason was aware of the fact that the Ifri could detonate themselves whenever they wanted, and it was already fortunate that not a single Ifrita seemed to have the Askron race's life force within their body. It would be the worst if several thousand opponents in whose center he stood would think that he was too much of a threat. This might even lead everyone to sacrifice their life to kill Jason. Fortunately, this couldn't happen, and Jason felt even calmer than he had been in the beginning. He slashed, sliced, and thrust out with Byakuya that felt like an extension of his arm. At the same time, more and more fingertip-sized black flames littered the whole battlefield. They began to nurture themselves, and the moment they had completed their task, they began to return to Jason, or rather Solaris. It was unknown how much time had passed, but the whole battlefield had become spooky and an eerie atmosphere permeated the air. Jason was still using his whole strength, without a minute decrease in his combat prowess as he killed one Ifrita and Ifri after another. He had lost count in how many lives he had reaped, but from the sheer number of black flames that floated towards him and Solaris, Jason could tell that it was not a small number. Even if Jason's mind was calm, it was the second time he killed former humans and individuals from a different race. If someone else were to know this, they would question how he was able to stay so calm, but Jason's whole mind was tranquil. Nothing interrupted his train of thoughts, and the only thing on his mind was Solaris' advancement. In the end, he had created the life force absorption ability faster than previously assumed. However, this originated from the fact that Solaris had been able to devour more powerful Creato Flames than before. The deceased Prisma, late and mid-lick stage Ifrita and Ifri had more powerful Creato Flames than the low and lowest lick stage opponents Jason was currently facing. Nevertheless, Solaris devoured everything in its way, which allowed it to duplicate the life force absorption ability. Jason was not sure how exactly it worked, but he could tell that it would be helpful to survive the fight that had been ongoing for quite some time. Suddenly, his mana eyes perceived something he had already expected to happen quite some time. Unfortunately, they had been too slow and reluctant to do that before, and their only opportunity had elapsed. Chapter 439 Annihilation by Hydesgrain. Jason's mana eyes perceived that every Ifri in his surroundings drew the compressed liquefied drop of life force towards their mana core. However, instead of panicking when he saw this, Jason rushed towards the closest Ifri that was about to pounce at him, trying to hold him down. The Ifri's strength was high, but it was not strong enough to keep hold of Jason, who had already pierced out with Byakuya. Yet, instead of distancing himself from the Ifrit that was about to explode, Jason twisted Byakuya within the Ifrit's body before he pulled it out. At the same time, his empty hand shot inside the deep wound he had instilled right next to the Ifrit's mana core. When his hand that was completely enveloped in Solari's black flame entered the Ifrit's body, he immediately grasped its mana core before tearing it out. At the same time, he activated Solari's new life force absorption ability while telling it to devour the Creato flame at once. Jason had already done a similar tactic before, while an Ifrit tried to sacrifice its own life to take him with it. However, right now, he was much cruder and showing off his capabilities because he wanted the Ifriter and Ifrit's morale to plummet further. He wanted them to fear him, not being able to execute their fullest capabilities to make his fight easier. This was sort of a tactic which he wanted to test out, as it was something he hadn't tried out often before. His plan seemed to work perfectly, as Jason crushed the first mana core in his hand, revealing dense drops of mana that began to pour down his wrist. Other than the liquefied mana, there was also the Creato flame that levitated in Jason's hand. However, it didn't take long before it was enveloped and devoured by Solris's black flames. Only a few moments were required to finish the deed. At the same time, Jason felt the blood-red life fist drop falling on his hand, as he could hear a sizzling sound. Only a second later his hand began to itch extremely. Fortunately, this pain dissipated when Solaris absorbed the drop of life fist that was about to burn into his hand. He didn't waste any more time and repeated the procedure he had already finished with the first Ifrit, only to notice that the other Ifrit had already appeared right next to him. This would have pressured Jason under normal circumstances, but Solaris had gained the ability to create wings some time ago. As such, he couldn't waste this opportunity. Jason inserted more mana into his Soulbond's manifested wings before he pushed his feet from the ground. He soared into the sky, escaping the Ifrit's grasp, and Jason could only see their terrified expressions that seemed to say, "Will our sacrifice be completely meaningless?" This was something Jason would have answered with a resolute, yes. The Ifrit were in fact transformed humans, and Jason had not even the tiniest respect for them. It was as if they had sold their soul to the Ifriter race, and Jason was sure that the Ifrit didn't care a single bit about the number of humans they had already killed. However, that was only if they survived today. Jason didn't plan to let anyone survive, and he wanted to annihilate the whole Ifriter army he was facing. At that moment, several Ifrit that were ordered to sacrifice themselves while holding Jason down exploded. The Creato flame within their mana core was unable to cope with the quantity and quality of the Askron race's compressed life force. Jason understood this problem completely because Solaris was currently trying to absorb the drop of life force it had taken into its mana core too. The sheer energy within the small drop of life force was enormous, and Jason began to wonder how many drops Solaris could absorb. However, when he heard Solaris' transmitted thought, his worry was washed away as he mumbled, "Annex as much soul energy as you want." Solaris had transmitted to Jason that the life force was able to nurture it as well as the soul energy it would have to burn, could. This meant that as long as Solaris was nurtured by life force drop, it was not required to destroy Jason's soul energy. In the end, this kind of trick was not something he could use all the time, and it felt as if it was something Solaris could only do a few times. By allowing Solaris to annex soul energy, Jason increased its strength by a large margin. It became continuously stronger, and once the explosion caused by the suicidal Ifrit had been colluded, Jason dived towards the ground, straight into the most crowded area Thafad the most Everis. Let's devour a few more life force drops. It was unknown how much time had passed, but the sun was already setting. Jason was gasping for air, and unable to stand properly as Fasro and the other Arior appeared next to him. Solaris' black flames that had enveloped him during the whole time had been retracted because neither Solaris nor Jason were able to cope with the huge mana consumption the black flames had by releasing its fullest capabilities. Solaris has already reached its limit for today. Jason thought while trying to make sense of everything. He didn't even remember how his massacre had ended, and the only thing he could tell for sure was that he had annihilated the entire Ephrata and Afri army. Jason's whole body pained, and he knew that he had reached his limit, while Solaris, whose soul energy had increased to around 200,000 units. This meant that it had annexed every single vacant soul energy unit within Jason. At the same, it meant that Solaris Flame's strength had increased to the late Lich or First Lord stage. Soul bonds at the Lord rank required between 100,000 and 1 to 10 million soul energy units. This stemmed from the fact that every breakthrough within the Lord rank was 1,000 new liquefied drops of mana. As such, soul bonds at the Lich stage had to annex between 2,000 and 1 to 10 million soul energy units to be under control. Once a beast broke to the Prisma stage, everything would change, but that was not something Jason had to think about now. Late Lich stage. Thinking that Solaris' strength had increased significantly, Jason was overjoyed, but at the same time, he was fully aware of the fact that his control over Solaris had decreased significantly. At the same time, the Black Flame's mana consumption had increased drastically. As such, he was unable to play around with the Solaris Flames as it had been possible before. In order to do that, he would have to increase the number of liquefied drops of mana within his mana core by a large margin. Nevertheless, while fighting against the Ephrata and Afri, he was completely fine. This was mainly because Solaris absorbed mana from the Ephrata and Afri's attacks. Exactly the same applied to the small fingertip-sized flames that had absorbed every Creato flame around him, which included its mana too. While fighting against Ephrata and Afri, I can utilize Solaris however I want, but I'll have to change my combat style for other opponents. Jason was fully aware of what kinds of disadvantages an overly powerful ability would bring, the loss of control and a much higher mana consumption. However, in the end, this was just something he had to adjust himself to, and it couldn't be considered a disadvantage. Solaris had become stronger after all. Fasro and the others had appeared next to him, but nobody said anything. In the beginning, Fasro had been worried that Jason would be severely injured. He and the other Arior made the huge mistake and underestimated their mana consumption and the number of high-ranked Ephrata among the small army they had faced. Because of that, Jason had to face Ephrata and Afri with 150 drops of liquefied mana. However, instead of receiving a few injuries, or even a shallow cut, Jason was completely unscathed. His strength increased while fighting against the Ephrata. His origin flame absorbed the Creato flames of the deceased. Meanwhile, the other Arior, who didn't know anything about Jason before, couldn't help but feel scared. In their opinion, the human race was extremely weak, which was the reason they required their help. Yet, from the massacre they had seen, this thought seemed to turn into a bad joke. To everyone who had seen the massacre of one person against several thousand opponents, it was clear that Jason was not an opponent one could take lightly. After the battle was over, Jason was extremely exhausted, and it didn't take long until he was unable to stay awake anymore. As such, he fell over, only to be caught by Fasro, who said, "You've done great, much better than we did. You've even fixed our mistake." Yazlawn Caves. A huge, 6-meter-tall Ephrata with dark red burning flames enveloping his body was sitting on a small throne, looking down on the scouts he had employed to look after the Arior race and Myoldra race's army. He did not expect them to return to their hideout, and the leader of the Ephrata race was about to lecture and punish them when he perceived their fear. This alarmed the Ephrata, and he immediately inquired, "What happened?" Like that, every single Ephrata and Afri got to know about Jason, his capabilities, and the fact that he had a high-grade origin flame that had attained the same ability as the Creato flames. Not only that was the case, but the scouts even said that the origin flame's strength increased, the longer the whole skirmish, if one was able to call it like that, lasted. Chapter 440 Discovered by Hydesgrain. When Jason woke up, he didn't take long to notice that he was lying inside a large and comfortable bed. Yet, instead of resting a little bit longer, which his body and mind needed, Jason got out of the bed. He was in a hurry because he was not sure how long he had slept. What if something happened to his masters while they fought on the Shabi clan's side against the Myldra's army? Jason had a bad premonition and he couldn't tell why, but something was bothering him. As such, he rushed outside the unknown room he had slept inside. Rushing through the floor he entered, Jason used his mana eyes to perceive everything in the surrounding area. There were only a few people around him, but he could tell that they had a low mana core rank. When he saw the first servant in front of him, Jason rushed towards the young maid, who seemed astonished that he was already awake. "Good morning, young lord, how are you feeling? We were told that you would be asleep for a few more days." Yet, Jason didn't even listen as he started to ask multiple questions in succession. How long have I slept? What exactly happened on the battlefield against the Myldra army? Do you know where my masters are? Jason was not even sure if the young maid knew who his masters were, but he couldn't help but be worried about them. However, after the young maid answered him, he was able to calm down. Young lord has slept for 4 days, and the Myldra race retreated after the first clashes. The whole fight took less than 3 hours. Young lord and the Arior were the last ones to return from the battlefield. About young lord's masters, Sir and Madam Blair are currently dining with the Shabi clan patriarch. They seem to be old acquaintances. After Jason had heard the young maid's words, he thanked her before rushing off. Only then did he realize that the young maid was staring intently at him. This caused him to look down, and he noticed why she had been staring at him. Jason was only wearing underwear right now. As such, he took a new set of clothes out of his spatial ring before he put it on, only to rush ahead. The maid called me young lord and seems to know about Shane and Dahlia. Has their identity been discovered? Because of this thought, Jason couldn't help but worry. The moment Jason left the large mansion he had slept inside, he manifested Artemis wings. Soaring into the sky, he took a proper look in his surroundings, only to figure out that he was in the noble district of the Shabi clan's headquarters. Apparently, the whole clan was constructed like a small city, and Jason had been oblivious to this fact. To him, it was not important whether the Shiabi clan headquarters was like a city, town, or only a single building. It didn't matter, and more important was to figure out whether Shane and Dahlia's identity has been discovered or not. He circulated a large amount of mana through his whole body, which included Artemis wings as he flew ahead. Only 5 minutes later he had already appeared in front of the Patriarch's dining hall. There were several guards protecting the gates of the dining hall, which was something entirely useless in Jason's opinion. Their strength was not even at the Prisma stage, and both Shane and the Shabi clan patriarch were much stronger than them. Jason would have had problems forcing his way through the guards, but the moment they saw him they bowed deeply towards him. This astonished him a little bit, and the fact that they let him through the gates told him that everyone knew something he was oblivious to. However, the moment he entered the dining hall that was filled with several dozen humans, Jason couldn't help but feel weird. His friends, masters, Emily, and many people with high-ranked mana cores were present. That was not all, because there were also a few Arior, namely Midra, Fasro, and Isla. Jason had already been aware of who he would encounter within the dining hall because his mana eyes revealed this fact, but he was still astonished. They were simply dining as if nothing had happened during the last few days, and the fact that Jason appeared in front of them with disarranged clothes seemed to be the only incident that was out of the ordinary. When Jason saw how everyone was eating so unbothered, he unintentionally said, "What kind of bullshit is that? I hope this is a bad dream." Jason's voice was loud enough to be heard by everyone. Both Shane and Dahlia couldn't help but stiffen for a moment before they glared at the disciple. The Shiabi clan's patriarch smiled lightly, and he was about to say something as Fasro exclaimed, You're already awake. Our healer estimated that you would need another week to replenish your energy, mana, and mental state. He sounded astonished, and when Jason heard this, he averted his attention from his masters to Fasro and his two siblings as he said, "My origin flame is special, as you might know. My mental state didn't receive a backlash or anything like that. It was possible for everyone to receive deep mental injuries when one fought for several hours while utilizing one's full combat prowess the entire time. However, Jason was still fine, if he were to ignore his exhaustion. In his opinion, eating enough and resting a little bit should be the solution to this problem. Nevertheless, Jason didn't care about this issue right now. He wanted to know what happened on the battlefield against the Myoldra race. He stared at Shane, who could only scratch the back of his head as he said with a faint smile, "I think you've already guessed it, but my identity has been exposed." Shane wanted to continue explaining something as Jason intervened. "Why are you even smiling right now? The Myoldra race colludes with the Drake family, and I doubt that the Drake family patriarch will stay idle when he hears about your existence here. And now everyone is dining here as if nothing had happened. Why does that seem wrong to me?" However, Dahlia couldn't help but defend Shane when she heard Jason's words. "Jason, calm down first. We know that you're worried about us, but it has already happened. We can't turn back time, right? Instead of being bothered about what has happened, let's take care of the present and future. Our identity has been exposed, but the Myoldra race has retreated, which gives us a small advantage. Furthermore, we heard what you've done. Great job, we are proud of you." Jason wanted to explode once again, but when he heard Dahlia's words, he couldn't help but quiet down. Only a moment later, Shane pulled back the empty chair next to him as he said, "You should be hungry, eat something first. We were about to discuss our next steps and only stopped by to eat something." He was a little bit embarrassed about his outburst, but nobody seemed to mind that. Everyone could tell that Jason had been worried about his masters, which was a good trait. With that in mind, the situation didn't turn awkward. Jason sat down next to Shane to dine with them. Jason was still feeling a little bit exhausted and weak, but when Solaris told him that it could help, his interest was ignited. As such, Solaris and Artemis changed the position within the mana core, and the black origin flame emerged within his body. It swept through his entire body within a single moment, and Jason felt invigorated. This astonished him, and he began to question how Solaris was capable of doing something like this. "Is that your new life force absorption ability?" Jason transmitted to Solaris, who seemed to answer him with a nod. At least that was how Jason perceived Solaris' answer to be. From the looks of it, Solaris was able to transfer the life force it could absorb to Jason. They were bound to each other, and the fortified soul conjunction should have been the reason for this to be possible. This new ability was a great asset, but both Artemis and Scorpio seemed to be displeased. They were jealous about the fact that Solaris was able to become so much stronger in such a short amount of time, and that Jason focused on using Solaris instead of them too. Their whole existence seemed to have turned insignificant to Jason. At least that was how they felt, and they had yet to find a solution about how they could change this problem.